Hello and welcome to the India Energy Hour. I am Sandeep Pai, a former journalist with Hindustan Times and now an energy researcher at the University of British Columbia.
And I'm Shreya Jay, journalist with Business Standard newspaper in Delhi, writing on the energy sector.
Together, we are really excited to co host a new podcast on India's energy transition, the India Energy Hour. This podcast is hosted by 101 Reporters, an innovative news agency that connects grassroots reporters and media houses to bring out untold stories. The show is produced by Tejas Dayan and Sagar of 101 Reporters.
In this podcast, we want to unpack and document India's energy transition. We will interview leading energy, development, and climate experts from academia, civil society, and the government. Through these interviews, we will explore the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities in the energy transition unfolding in India. We will examine the role of government, finance, social justice, and science. Over time, we will feature other countries of the global south as well.
COP26, the world's biggest climate change conference, is now only a week away. After traversing through the history and functioning of climate negotiations in the first part of our COP special series, in this second part, we delve into key negotiation points at COP26, India's role in current negotiations, and what could be the bottlenecks and common grounds between developed and developing world. For this episode, we interviewed R.R. Rashmi, Distinguished Fellow and Program Director, Earth Science and Climate Change at the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI. Mr. Rashmi was India's former principal negotiator for climate change negotiations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Welcome, sir. This is such a treat to have you on the podcast. I cannot think of anybody better to talk about this topic of COP and, India's position and how COP26 could look like. And I'm really, really excited about this episode. This is part 2 of our COP special. But before we begin, we really want to know about your story. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? What did you study? How did you become an IAS officer? And then from there on, sort of, how did you get interested in environment? And, you're one of the few people, even post-retirement, sort of you're really taking that, interest in climate change and, talking and advocating about these issues. So we'd love to know about your story.
Thank you, Sandeep, first for having me on your show and on your talk. It's indeed an extremely interesting journey which I have made into the climate change area. I never thought of it when I joined the service. I joined the service, the Indian Administrative Service in 1983. And for the first 20 years, in fact, I was doing finance, public finance in the state government. And even in the central government, I was looking at international trade when I joined way back in 2000. So it has been a mix of the experiences and the issues that I have dealt with in my career. Like any other IAS officer, first you go through the normal grinding of doing the work at the subdivisional level, the block level, the district level. Then you come to the government at the state level. So I have gone through all that. So my career in the stint in the public administration started from the border areas of Manipur state, which is a far-flung state, one of the border states of the northeastern India. And when I joined the service, I had not expected that I will land in such a far area, bordering Myanmar. But the experience was fantastic. I have begun to love the place. It's an extremely lovable place. Its culture is absolutely amazing. The way the people have preserved their culture for the last 400 years, the Vaishnavite culture, which is an impact of Bengal on Manipur. So it's an interesting place, and I learned the art of the public administration from there. Then I moved to the central government after about 16, 17 years. Then I joined the Ministry of Commerce, where I learned the tricks of the international trade. Then I went over to Brussels in the our mission to the European Union, where I handled the issues of trade, engineering, environment also. So that was my first brush with environmental issues. Before that, all along, I had handled the issues of public finance in the state. At the secretariat level, I was finance secretary for about 10, 11 years in different steps. But I came to know of the issues of environment through trade in a way. And then that was my first exposure. And European Union, as you know, it represents a group of countries which have always been in the vanguard of environmental actions. So I got to know of what Europe thinks about environment. And when I came back, of course, I came back to the state government again. I lost touch with it. But I got an opportunity to work in the Ministry of Environment in 2008 when I was drafted to handle the climate change issues. And I readily agreed because I had an exposure to the international negotiations while working in the Ministry of Commerce. And in fact, that's what perhaps brought me to this position in the government of India. They found someone who had this kind of exposure to international work. The climate change negotiations at that time were just beginning to, pick up momentum. So I landed in the ministry in 2008, and then went on. Did my full term of 5 years, but that was the build up to the Paris Agreement. That was the period when everybody was actually working with great intensity on these issues pertaining to climate change at the national level as well as the global level. In our government, of course, the national actions were inspired by what was happening at the global. The push which was taking place in course of these negotiations, that was instrumental in guiding the actions of the government of India. So it was an amazing experience when I joined the Ministry of Environment, Forest. At that time, it was not called Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. It was simply called Ministry of Environment and Forest. So I did and loved the experience. It opened my eyes to the rest of the world about how the environmental politics takes place more than environmental management. That concern is always there. But at the global level, it's not just concern about the environment, it's also about politics of how much one country can extract by negotiating its position with the other countries. So that's also an art of diplomacy. So as we talk of sustainable development, it's normally we talk of three dimensions, social, environmental, and economic. I would add the fourth one, the political, when we talk of global concerns about environmental issues like climate change. So I did my 5 years. I went back to the state. I Ministry of Commerce for commodities, in touch with the environmental issues affecting agriculture and plantations. Plantations is an issue which is handled by Ministry of Commerce because most of the plantation commodities are export oriented. Like coffee, spices, tea, rubber. So all these are export oriented commodities, and I had an exposure to these issues once again. And environment plays a large role in production and management of the supply system there. So in a way, my association with environment continued there, and then I came back to the ministry once again in my final lap when I was special secretary there, and I again handled the climate change issues. So I had seen the momentum building up to the Paris Agreement, and I also saw how the countries were responding to the post-Paris issues in my last stint in the Ministry of Environment. By that time, it had been christened that Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Mr. Prakash Javadekar was the minister, perhaps during this stint this happened. So I have seen the build up to the agreement in Paris, also the issues that have arisen after that. And now we are in a phase where we are not simply looking at the issues immediately arising out of the Paris Agreement, but the issues in the long term, issues of long-term growth, long-term sustainable growth. So that's how I got in touch with the environment, and I really enjoyed my both stints, and I thought it would be good to keep my association with the environment even after I hang up my boots in the government. After my stint in the ministry, I went back to the state as chief secretary, the head of the administration there. I did my stint there, and then I fortunately got a call from the then DJ of TERI, Mr. Yamato. I'm ever grateful to him for having retained my association with the environment. He offered me a position which I couldn't refuse. So I said I'm perfectly fine with my association with TERI, because this will ensure my continuity of my association with the climate change issues. Uh, Begun to feel that climate change issues are not just about the environment, but about the long-term social economic development. Because, in course of the negotiations on climate change, we felt that we are dealing practically with every aspect of society and economics. We deal with, for example, climate justice or adaptation issues, which affect our livelihood, affect our social systems, affect our rural communities, their capacities. Then we also deal with the energy issues, which is energy supply, energy demand systems, extremely technical issues. We deal with the technology issues, again, highly technical issues involving issues like IPR, things like that. So, in a way, dealing with climate change issues gives us a very wide range of actions, wide range of ideas and issues which connect us with the rest of the society. That's why I have liked my continuity of my association with climate change, and I'm really fortunate that um, I have had an opportunity of doing that.
This is great, and I would like to believe that your career trajectory in itself is quite parallel to India's journey on the global stage of climate change as well. So I think your career still provides a great primer to our conversation topic today. So I would just directly delve into it, and I want to ask you that, given that you have been India's principal negotiator for climate change, and then you have been to many COPs and have extensively interacted with the stakeholders, how have you observed rather India's position changing on this global stage of climate change negotiation? In terms of the demands that we have put, in terms of our own targets, and all in all, our negotiation capacity. What changes have you seen in these many years?
Uh, when I began to participate in the climate change negotiations, I saw that the world was clearly divided. The convention and the Kyoto Protocol itself have created a framework where the world is divided between developed and developing countries. And amongst the developing countries, India was fairly well respected. And even today, it is respected as one of the leaders, both in terms of thought, in terms of ideas, as well as actions. Not only because of its intellectual capacity, but also because India is a large country. It has struggled for its freedom. So it is kind of a representative for the rest of the world, which had suffered from lack of development and the burden of colonization. So initially, I felt that the developed countries looked at us as naysayers. We didn't believe in climate change. It was not actually so, because a country like India has all along, for the last thousands of years, we have suffered from the ravages of climate. As you can see, the climate is so variable in our country. If the monsoon fails, farmers are totally at the mercy of the nature, and they lose their livelihood, they lose their productivity. We suffer from water shortages, floods, and droughts and cyclones. These have been part of our life. Climate variability has been a part of our life. And we have learned to adapt to these climatic problems for I don't know how many years, thousands of years of our social and economic development. So therefore, it's not a question of India not believing in climate change, but the way we need to handle climate change. For most of the developed countries, I realized that their entire focus was on reducing emissions. And the convention required them to reduce emissions. Therefore, for them, the priority for the rest of the world also became reducing emissions. That's how the problem began. And then this was really unfortunate, this mindset of divided world. And because of this, there was a resistance to change. I sense that the developed countries, which constituted one specific group under the convention and the Kyoto Protocol, and which were required to reduce their emissions, they didn't do it purely for competitive reasons. As you might remember, George Bush had walked out of the Kyoto Protocol even after having negotiated it. And the reason entirely being that, as they used to say, that unless large countries or large emitters like China and India joined the Kyoto Protocol or undertook responsibilities at a similar level as the countries in the developed world, they wouldn't agree to any emission reduction target. This is one point of view, but I think it doesn't arise from an appreciation of the urgency of the climate change. This is entirely an issue of the competitive, how countries can compete with each other rather than how countries can cooperate with each other. So this was the scene which I saw when I started joining the negotiations and participating in them. But then over a period of time, I think the Indian policymakers and leaders realized that it was good to engage not from a position of being asked to do something, but establishing a position where they should demonstrate their positive actions and then negotiate from a position of strength. So as a result, I was a part of that process when in 2008 the National Action Plan on Climate Change was formulated for the first time, India's National Action Plan. And there were 8 missions. 3 of them were clearly focused on mitigation, and rest 5 were focused on adaptation issues. But when I say 3 missions focused on mitigation, I must clarify that it was not about reducing emissions. It was pursuing a path of sustainable development, which would ensure that we make a transition in the areas of energy use, in the area of energy efficiency. So one mission was dedicated to energy efficiency. The second mission was on finding new sources of energy like solar. And the third one, in a way, was sustainable habitat, which actually talked of waste to energy. It's not a very significant sense, but they did make a beginning in that direction. And the other mission on forests, which had both adaptation as well as mitigation component, because forests constitute a large carbon sink. So for the first time, the government of India also started talking of forests as afforestation as possible means of addressing climate change by enhancing the carbon sink. So these 3 were, of course, missions which related to the emissions. The rest of them were about protecting the ecosystem and protecting our economic systems like agriculture, water, Himalayan ecosystem, habitat. So that was the first response of the government of India to the global negotiations on climate change, which were stuck in this developed and developing mindset. And then it was a good way of demonstrating to the rest of the world that India meant business. India was not shying away from its responsibility being a large country. So it was a large emitter, but it had a historical sense of how the society should develop, how things can move. What the rest of the world didn't realize, that India was a country, developing country, and at the same time, India had practically no access to alternative sources of energy at that point. So, from that perspective, India's actions were, this national plan was fairly ambitious, I must say. And then this ambition grew in future. In 2009, the Copenhagen happened. The Copenhagen conference was one of the defining moments of climate change history, where the conference failed to come to an agreement, but the conference did produce a significant consensus amongst the key countries. The countries like the basic countries, the group of 4 basic countries which came together to deal with, negotiate with Barack Obama directly, and then produce a document which became the cornerstone of what is called Copenhagen Accord. So in 2009, it was immediately after, a year after we had released the National Action Plan on Climate Change, when India and all other developing countries together agreed on something called transparency of actions. 2009, when the conference in Copenhagen took place, the conference could not come to a consensus. There was no formal agreement, but there was an accord which was, noted by the conference. It was not an agreement in the sense Paris Agreement took place. That was the ambition of many of the developed countries at that time, that they would produce a global agreement, but it couldn't happen. They couldn't actually see the mood of the rest of the world. So the agreement got rejected, but the agreement was noted by the participating the member countries of the UNFCCC, and they then, under the leadership of the US, although US was not a party to the protocol, the Barack Obama administration started working with everyone to ensure that the Copenhagen Accord was implemented at least on a voluntary basis, and that's how this transparency arrangements came into place. Something which is called IAR, International Assessment and Review for the Developed World, and International Assessment and Consultation for the Developing Countries. So the countries like India agreed to report internationally what they were doing domestically in terms of targets. There were no targets in absolute term or relative term, no numerical targets, but those targets were purely voluntary in nature at the domestic level. For example, India took a target of reducing its emissions intensity by 25% compared to 2005 level. So it was a domestic ambition, but India agreed to report its actions and its progress on this goal internationally to the UNFCCC. And there was a significant difference here in the terminology that we used at that point in time. I was joint secretary in the ministry, so we were very careful about how we would phrase the expression. We said it's a goal, it's not a target. So 25% emissions intensity reduction was a domestic goal. Goal is it's possible that you might not achieve that goal. So you can't be held accountable for not achieving that goal. We were extremely careful in using that expression so that the international community did not put any onus on or did not hold us liable for what we couldn't achieve because of lack of resources or lack of capacity. So that was Copenhagen. An important thing which I have noticed that each year, building from 2008 onwards, some concessions were extracted by the developed world from the developing countries in form of greater and greater participation, and elevating their actions and the nature of their actions towards a specific target at the international level. So as I said, the 2008 was the expression of the national plan, 2009 was transparency. Next year, what happened was remarkable. Next year came the 2-degree goal, global goal. Prior to that, there was a talk of a global goal. But the global goal, as you might have noticed under the UNFCCC, it is an Article 2 expression, which is sustainable development, food security, economic progress, everything is included there. But there is no global goal in terms of temperature target. But in the year 2009 and 10, there was a discussion on this, and finally this 2-degree goal was also agreed. So the Copenhagen Accord actually makes a mention of this in a very brief manner, that everybody had agreed to work towards that. And naturally, when you agree to a goal at the global level in terms of a specific temperature target, then there are certain responsibilities implicit in that. Everyone has to undertake that responsibility. So this was an indication of how a monitorable target started evolving on to the developing countries. Like 2010, the Cancun conference took place, where everybody agreed to implement the Copenhagen Accord in a formal way. Last year, they couldn't do it. So Cancun was essentially building a global consensus around the Copenhagen Accord. So it was formalized there. And that was the template which has finally been adopted in the Paris Agreement. As you can see, all the elements in terms of nationally appropriate mitigation actions of developing countries, of developed countries, climate finance, transparency, the technology mechanism, all these elements are now found in the Paris Agreement in a slightly more nuanced and enhanced manner. 2011 was again quite a dramatic year because the Kyoto Protocol was coming to an end, and by 2012, so everybody was insistent that we must find a new way forward because all the hopes of reviving the Kyoto Protocol or continuing it beyond a particular period of time, the second commitment period, was very uncertain. So I think what the countries finally agreed, India was a part of that, in lieu of continuation of the Kyoto Protocol into its second commitment period, the world would agree to launch a new framework of negotiations for a different kind of arrangement, which would not be in the nature of Kyoto Protocol, where the developing world had no clear responsibilities in terms of emissions reduction, but the developed world had. So this arrangement would give way to a universal arrangement where everyone would undertake some kind of responsibility in a monetary way. And that is what happened finally. At Durban, it created a platform for negotiation on a new treaty or a new agreement. It doesn't replace the UNFCCC, but it did create a new platform. And that finally led to the Paris Agreement being negotiated 15, where India, like any other country, has also agreed to express an international target and implement it and report it internationally under transparency arrangements and be fully accountable for it does. So that is, gradually the position has changed from having no internationally monitored target to now an internationally monitored target. That is the substantive change which has taken place in India's position over the years. And this is true not only of India, of all developing countries like China. In fact, China is a much greater target of these developed countries' insistence on international targets because China's emissions are larger than that of India. They constitute now almost 26% of the current emissions. So the second important point, which is important to note, is that these negotiations over a period of 5 to 6 years, from 2008 to 2015, also established the principle of current emissions guiding the entire framework for future actions. Till 2015, the entire framework was based on historical responsibility. But today, historical responsibility is a principle enshrined in the convention. It is still there. It is actually not specifically mentioned in so many words in the convention, but it is the foundation on which protocol was built. But the framework was guided by the principle of historical responsibility. But it has finally given way in the Paris Agreement to current emissions. And of course, there are issues around fixing the global targets entirely based on current emissions. I'll try to explain that as we move along. But there is no doubt that the world has changed since 2008 in that sense. The current emissions have become the guiding framework, and all the developing countries have also agreed to express and implement their international targets in a monetary sense. These are the fundamental changes which have happened in India, and I think it's good for India, it's good for the rest of the world, because we are participating in a global project, and I think we should all work towards that in a transparent manner.
Wonderful. Wow, that was such an interesting history of how India's position has changed. So now let's move from history to present. We are at the cusp of this really important COP that's going to happen very soon. Already this COP was delayed and, many reports have come out and, which have warned that temperatures may rise really quickly, including the IPCC report, which called the world the code red of for humanity. So given that the pressure is really building in this COP to take multiple actions, could you talk about what are some of the really key issues, if you have to highlight 3, 4 key issues that policymakers around the world would negotiate? And within that, what would be India's position with regards to some of those issues?
I think in the Glasgow conference, 4 issues are going to be the key issues which will dominate the discussions. One is the issue of enhancement of the NDCs. Second, related to the NDCs, is that of climate finance, availability of resources for implementing the NDC actions. Because a large part of the NDCs in many countries are conditional NDCs. So that will be the second most important issue. And the third, of course, the issue of the something which could not be resolved in Katowice and Madrid, the issue of carbon markets under Article 6, which is a residual issue of, as far as modalities and guidelines are concerned. But the last point, which would be actually a political issue, is that of the net zero goal in the long term. So whether the world should move towards complete decarbonization in a fixed manner, together, uniformly, and universally is going to be another key issue. So these, I think, are going to be the framework in which the Glasgow negotiations will be held. I am not sure of how government of India is going to handle these issues, but from whatever I have seen and learned and understood, I do feel that the issue of NDCs enhancement is something which can be handled most easily because India's progress on its current NDC is fairly good. It has shown extremely positive progress in achieving its emissions intensity goal as well as the goal of creating the renewable energy capacity. It's against the goal of reducing its emissions intensity by 33 to 35% by 2030. It has already achieved in 2016. As per the data published in 2016, the reduction is already 24%. So it's quite, it's easy to expect that India will achieve, maybe overachieve its emissions intensity target. But it's important to note that the emissions intensity decline takes place because of technological changes and the new measures which industry and other stakeholders employ. And one of the major causes of this is energy efficiency improvements across the industry. One of the missions, as I said, under the National Action Plan is focused on energy efficiency. And there is a market mechanism also being employed to achieve that in terms of targets. So this is partly a result of that. Over a period of time, the energy transition also is equally important. That is the second goal, which also India has demonstrated a fairly good progress against a target of creating 40% renewable energy capacity by 2030. They have already achieved almost 38%. Already in the year 2020, the achievement, the level is 38% if you include the hydroelectric component, large hydro. But even if you exclude the large hydro, I think the progress is still fairly good, it's about 32%. So there is absolutely no doubt by that much before 2030, the renewable energy capacity target. On the forestry side, where there is a target of creating additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon, it is not as dramatic. But I think the problem here is of resources and of any, there is a lack of any major program of creating this additional carbon stock. Currently, they are handling the forestry target only through the ongoing programs like Green India Mission or National Afforestation Program, but they haven't made much headway because they don't have sufficient resources. So, if adequate resources are deployed in the forestry area and some innovation is carried out, I think it's possible to maybe meet this target, provided the programs are imaginative in nature, because the forestry emissions are temporary by nature. We are growing. In fact, the Forest Service says that our forest area is increasing. The green cover may not be increasing as much, but the forest area is being protected. So that's a good sign. But the land can be degraded even if the forest area is protected, and then we might be losing the carbon sink there. So this is a tricky question, but with some imagination, innovation, and resources, I think this problem can be handled. So generally, by and large, I think India has done well on the MDCs, and should be in a position to negotiate from a position of strength to handle this pressure on enhancing the MDCs. Pressure from the rest of the world will be to see that India enhances its NDC targets. It's a matter of how the whole discussion is framed. We can't see NDC enhancement as independent, isolated action. It's a part of the overall framework of negotiations. As I said, it's related to the climate finance question. If there is no significant movement in terms of climate finance provision by the developed world, I think the talks might not progress that much. So even Alok Sharma, the COP president, has noted that climate finance is an important deliverable for him at this COP. I don't know how he's going to manage it because $100 billion itself is a big, big task. So far, although US has agreed to double its contribution, Germany has also announced increase in its contribution. UK has done, EU has done, but it falls way behind what the world can achieve in terms of $100 billion targets. The OECD report says that they have already achieved almost $72 or $75 billion of climate finance flows. But the rest of the world doesn't believe in that because it includes mobilized finance and leveraged finance, private sector finance flows, which is not really climate finance as per the definition agreed in the convention. So, finance, I think, will remain a tricky issue. If we are able to crack this nut, we will be able to crack the NDC nut as well. The third issue, as I said, was the carbon market issue. And here, the legacy credits coming from CDM days, Kyoto Protocol days, will be a bone of contention. Because many of the developed countries don't want these legacy credits to be allowed in the new arrangements. But I feel that some kind of a give and take here is a must for the new arrangements to pick off. And of course, the emphasis in the new arrangements is going to be on environmental integrity, but the double counting issues will, I think, continue to upset the discussions here. Because double counting is something on which is a sensitive issue, whether the emission reductions which take place in finance projects should be taken into account in meeting the NDC goals, or should they be transferred as part of internationally traded mitigation obligations. The arrangements are fuzzy in nature at this moment, so there will still be, I think, some difficulty here in achieving a final agreement. I think my talks might get further protracted. This is not a good sign because market must get up and be on its feet to be able to help the countries. I have always felt that carbon markets should actually be an instrument of supporting and financing the projects in the developing countries. Unfortunately, this is not the way the developed countries think. So this will remain a sticky issue for some time. And the last one, of course, is the net zero goal, which several countries have announced, and they would expect India also to make an announcement. Well, I feel that this is something about which people are making too much of noise without much substance. Net zero goal is a goal in the future in 2050. What is difficult here is the timeline. So, talking of a timeline at a global goal is one thing, but talking of a goal at the national level is completely another. And then for a country like India, I think it's not possible to agree to a specific timeline at all. There is absolutely no doubt about the utility or the relevance of a long-term goal for complete decarbonization. Everybody, in a way, would agree to that because if the global goal of 2 degree or 1.5 degree stabilization has been agreed, it is implicit that we will have to achieve a complete decarbonization to be able to go to this goal. But what is tricky is agreeing to a specific timeline because the trajectories of countries, emissions trajectories are different. That is not clear. No action plan has been given by any country. So I think this goal is at the moment only a political goal. Even if countries agree to adopt this as a political goal, it's not going to make much of an impact as far as immediate actions are concerned.
Fascinating. I mean, these are all like excellent, key issues. I think I was also reflecting on each of them as you were describing, and I think they are going to be quite sticky. So I have two follow-up questions on these 4 points that you articulated. One pertains to climate finance, which has been and will be a sticky point. And as you said, obviously the US administration has declared that they will increase the climate finance, and so have other countries. I mean, first of all, I think that US, like President Biden still has to take that announcement to Congress to get approval. So it's, in that sense, it's not like a final amount that, they have declared and the money will flow. So taking that as a background, I mean, will India personally benefit from this climate finance? And is that enough? Even if India were to get some share of this 100 billion everywhere, is it enough for a country like India? Or is India really negotiating about climate finance because it's an articulation of, common but differentiated responsibility? So what I'm asking is, from a financial point of view, if let's say the 5 billion out of that 100 billion comes to India, is that enough? If not, then is the articulation more of like, this is a way to continue to articulate that it's a reflection of common but differentiated responsibility? So that's my first question. But I can remind you about the second question. But my second question was about net zero. I think the key sticky point for net zero remains coal, right? I think Alok Sharma, the president, and others really want India to talk about a phase out date for coal. And that I think is another sticky point, which obviously is connected to net zero. And India may or may not, be ready to commit to any kind of coal phase out or reduction. Your thoughts on these two topics, climate finance and coal?
I think as far as climate finance issue is concerned, your the latter formulation appears to be more closer to the truth, which is that for a country like India, it is not what the US promises is important. What is important is the principle of differentiation. That in terms of climate finance, the developed world has an obligation which they must fulfill. They must support the countries in achieving global goals. And there are different ways in this support can be provided. A country like India has so far shown its progress on its NDCs entirely with its own resources. It hasn't depended on the international funds largely. And then you will be surprised to know that the green fund or green resources that are being mobilized within the country, as per an assessment made by the Ministry of Finance itself, and I was a part of that subcommittee on finance, climate finance, it estimated that the 80% of the domestic resources are coming from the commercial banking system of within the country. Less than 15 to 20% comes from outside in different forms, either in forms of investment in the green bonds or bilateral funds or multilateral funds. So India is not depending on international resources for meeting its climate goals. That is very clear. And in future also, if we really want the growth, our sustainable growth to remain sustainable, then we will have to find sustainable resources. We cannot depend entirely on international flows. Of course, it will be unrealistic to expect that the developed countries will earmark funds to the extent of $100 billion out of their own budgets to finance climate actions in the developing countries. It's certainly not going to happen. What might happen is that they will put some funds at a slightly higher scale in the green climate fund, and then expect the rest of the world to follow suit. So, as far as climate finance is concerned, for a country like India, it's more an issue of principle, a negotiating strategy to impress upon the developed world that they must see these responsibilities as differentiated. And that should permeate all the actions under the UNFCCC, not just in the field of finance, but also in the field of emissions reductions in the future. So that was a response to your first point. The second point was about the net zero goal. Net zero goal is a long term. But if there is an effort to convert that net zero long term goal into an immediate goal for coal phase out, I think there could be a problem here. You saw the problem which took place in the meeting of the G20 energy and climate ministers, where they had to issue a separate statement purely to accommodate India's view. So, in my view, I think the coal phase out is a question which should not be related to the net zero goal. It's a part of decarbonization process, and it should be a process of a long-term sustainable growth rather than specific targets following from a net zero undertaking. So, in my view, all along I have felt that we should press for a long-term low carbon or sustainable growth process, part of which, and then the long-term aim of this development trajectory should be achieving net zero goal at the end or complete decarbonization. That is the ultimate goal which nobody can actually disagree with. So, but putting a specific timeline or converting this into a goal for phasing out coal is rather unrealistic. Explaining this point a little further, I must tell you that the Central Electricity Authority, the plan which they have prepared, the electricity plan for the country for 2027, they assume that a maximum of 37,000 megawatts will be added by 2027 in the country. And this is a fair assessment because the energy demand in the country is going to go up by 3 times. So energy supply also must rise by that amount. And this kind of enhancement in the energy supply cannot come entirely from renewable energy, because there is a balancing requirement. So either in terms of hydro or nuclear or coal, there must be some balancing energy supply in the grid. And so coal will have to find a place in our overall energy system, at least for some time to come. This point should be realized by all the people who are negotiating the climate process. Simply drawing up a mechanical trajectory for country at the global level is not realistic. In fact, India has, I was struck by a finding that the coal-fired energy or coal-fired power as a proportion of our total energy supply has already stagnated since 2015. It's not growing any further in terms of ratio. What is the rising is the absolute quantum, and that absolute quantum may rise for some time, but it will be evened out in the long term by the phasing out of the older coal units. There is already a plan of phasing out almost 27,000 megawatts of existing coal capacity by 2027 and adding another 40 plus 30, so about total 60, 70,000 megawatts. So on a net basis, we don't see an increase of more than 40,000 megawatts in terms of coal. And that's fairly pragmatic for a large country like India, which has to meet its energy demand and the balancing the grid demand. So we should not be overly concerned about the coal issue. And I hope the negotiators in Glasgow will not remain stuck on this.
Thank you for that. I wanted to ask something on this coal phasing out policy or the lack of it in India. One reason that probably this coal generation capacity has plateaued is because the demand has not been driving it up that well. There were obviously these years of COVID, and before that also demand has not been rising in this country as it was expected to be in the range of 6 to 8%. It is lower than that. But going forward, we do expect demand to come up. There would be industrialization, there would be infrastructure creation. And obviously, India has had two major programs for universal electrification and metering, which in itself would lead to energy demand. My question, therefore, is that we are not committing to phasing out of coal because we lack a data set or a lack of planning when it comes to how much our demand would be. So we are not able to guess that we do not know how demand will grow, so we cannot tell you how much will we be able to phase out coal, because coal continues to be our backbone. But on the other hand, we do have these grand renewable energy targets. So is this country not confident enough that we would be reaching 450 gigawatt of renewable energy, or renewable energy cannot support our grid, so we will continue to rely on coal? Because if you look at from a bird's eye point of view, it looks like that there is some lacuna in data and planning when it comes to India discussing coal. India discussing renewable sounds very, very charming, for a developing country to have these set of ambitious targets, but this country never talks about coal, and I want to know why.
No, I don't fully agree with this line of thinking. I think there is a formal official statement on the electricity plan for the country. As I said, this national electricity plan was prepared, I think, in 2018 or 2017, and in the time frame of 2027. And it presents global picture of all the sources of energy which are going to be available to us by 2027. And the coal requirement has already been quantified there in terms of both additional capacity creation, including phase out. So I don't think there is a lack of data as far as assessment of coal energy is concerned. All assessments say that our energy requirement will triple by 2040, 2045, and certainly by 2050. So therefore, we need to keep in view our capacity in terms of energy supply as well. And this electricity plan is certainly going to be revised in the next 5 years again. So then we will have an opportunity to revisit this whole issue. The other issue of renewable energy is important, but it's significant to note that this national electricity plan also includes a target of 225 megawatt of renewable energy. It's only that this 225 megawatt target has been raised to 450 because of the recent announcements. So to that extent, the electricity plan does get revised, but it doesn't mean that coal should go down by that proportion. Renewable energy does not replace coal at this moment. It fulfills the rising energy demand and it fulfills the need of variable energy. As far as the peak demand is concerned, that still continues to be supplied by coal and nuclear and hydro. So we need to see this in two separate boxes. We cannot pit one against the other.
I completely agree on that. Renewables can't replace coal as of now in this country. Obviously, it will meet the incremental demand, as you also mentioned. And you talked about phasing out older coal units, something that we discussed in our last episode with Dr. Rashmi of IISc Bangalore. But you mentioned about National Electricity Plan. One very fascinating thing about this NEP is that in its draft stage, it had said that India does not need any coal-based power. And after a lot of hue and cry from the thermal industry led by state-owned power generator NTPC, they revised that target and said, no, we would need this much amount of coal instead. So I think going forward, when India starts aggressively talking about, phasing out coal or retiring older units, there would be these stakeholders. As you mentioned, that politics forms a big part of these negotiations. Would this country also see something similar to what US or UK are witnessing in terms of their coal or gas industry for that matter? Do you envisage something like that happening, and what is the way out there?
See, I cannot see what the negotiators are going to say there, but from my own perspective, I think that we should resist this coal issue being stretched beyond a point because it's not immediately relevant for the NDCs for 2030. It is relevant to some extent for the 2050 net zero goal. But again, it's an issue of balancing the net zero discussion against the NDC discussion, 2030 discussion. So, whichever gets more importance, I think the coal issue will play out accordingly. If we remain focused on 2030 NDCs, coal is not relevant at all. But if we bring in the net zero coal issue, coal remains relevant. But I think we should insist that the coal issue is a domestic issue. We cannot convert this into an international commitment at all because the future is uncertain. The demand trajectory and the energy supply trajectory is completely uncertain. And the major difference between India and the rest of the world, or the developed world, whose names you had mentioned, is that they have assured access to alternative energy sources in form of natural gas or shale gas, which India doesn't have. India has only renewable energy. And we are importing all of our natural gas. We are even importing our coking coal. We are importing coal to the extent of 30% to support our industrial energy demand. So India is in a completely different league. There cannot be a mechanistic or mechanical application of the emissions trajectory being followed in the rest of the world to Indian conditions.
That's great. I have one last question. We covered lots of different topics from net zero to climate finance. How do you see, as being someone who has dealt with this topic so closely, what would you rate this conference to be a success? And what would be the minimum of that? And what would be, the dream, I would say, Glasgow? And within that, so at that question is at a global level. So what do you think would be bare minimum that needs to happen to make this COP a success? And what would be the maximum? But within that, what would be an ideal outcome for a country like India?
From India's perspective, I think we should look at effective mechanisms for financing flows to be established. An effective cooperative framework for achieving our NDCs, enhanced and ambitious NDCs. I don't see any particular difficulty in India agreeing to this cooperative framework as long as others also raise their targets in a similar manner as part of them. But the principle of effort sharing is extremely important. The present record is not very assuring. The NDC synthesis report, which was brought out by the UNFCCC just last fortnight, it says that globally the emissions are still rising. The globally emissions are rising not because of India and China, but they're rising because the developed countries have not reduced at the scale at which they were expected to do. They were expected to peak their emissions in 1990, 3 decades ago. But they have still been growing all these 30 years. So the onus of reducing these emissions cannot lie entirely on developing countries like India and China and Brazil and South Africa. The developed countries must make much greater effort in terms of effort sharing principles, and those arrangements should be established. So, if the Glasgow conference has to succeed, I think we should ask for NDC's enhancement in a globally cooperative framework based on effort sharing principles, and to see that every country must do its fair share in emission reductions. There are other difficulties with this fair share principle because nobody agrees on what a fair share is. Some people say it's per capita principle. Some people say it's overall current emissions, the constant ratios in terms of emissions. Some say historical responsibility. Some say responsibility and capability mix. But whichever one is adopted, I think by and large, India has met its fair share. The rest of the countries have faltered in doing that. So the enhancement of the NDCs should take place as per the fair share principle. That is the minimum which we should insist on. There can be a separate discussion on what should be the level. But once this principle is agreed, but I think to that extent, there should be no problem in India participating in a enhanced framework. Second issue is that of the financing flows. And I think the present financing arrangements have been found inadequate. Simply saying that the total mobilization is almost $80 billion is not enough. It needs to be actually seen in the context of the climate ambitions. They have said that the annual requirement for the next 10 years is in the range of $200 billion. But do we have finance available at this scale, either domestically or internationally? If internationally no capital is available to finance climate actions at this level, the entire responsibility falls on the domestic system, which cannot find resources at this scale. So the difficulty is that the global financial system is not able to bring down the cost of capital for climate. Nobody is saying that all the money must come from the budgets of the countries. The funds have to be mobilized and leveraged through multilateral system or commercial system or the private financial system. It must take place. But the public grants or the climate funds being put in by the developed countries should act as the core element of grants and concessions, which will bring down the cost of capital. So the issue in Glasgow should be what kind of arrangement should be put in place, which will ensure that this will happen, that the cost of international capital goes down, and in fact lower than the rest of the capital for the rest of the sectors. For any green investments, the cost should be lower. That should be the bottom line. But the present arrangements are clearly inadequate. I have often wondered whether we can borrow the Montreal Protocol model, which was used for fighting the ozone depleting substances. Can we borrow that model and use for climate in terms of an outcome-based financing? If the industries or investors are able, or the project proponents are able to show that they have reduced their emissions from the activities financed by international capital or international climate finance, then I think to that extent they should be supported and they should be assisted to that extent. And this has been successfully done in the field of ozone depleting substances. So why can't we do it in the area of CO2 or methane emissions? I fail to understand. But this is a key question which climate finance should address.
Thank you so much. This was great. I when we started, I did think that we will cover a lot of ground, but this was an amazing conversation. And I guess you will be going to COP, right, sir?
So far, the plan is yes, but one has to keep one's fingers crossed.
No, this is great because we would love to catch you again after you're back to discuss what all went down there. It would be good to discuss. But thank you for this conversation. Thanks a lot. We learned a lot. And I'm really happy that we covered such a wide range of issues in this. So thank you again.
And big thank you from my side also. It was such a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. Thank you, Shreya, and your team.
For more information about the podcast, visit us online at www.101reporters.com/podcast/. facebook.com/the_India_energy_hour. You can also reach out to us on social media and send us your comments and suggestions. My Twitter handle is @SandeepPai with a double I, and Shreya's Twitter handle is @Shreya_J.